We have all found ourselves in a noisy setting, at a party or in a theater, perhaps in a crowded bus, perhaps in a large sports arena. Nonetheless, and even when the background noise is very loud, we've been able to continue a conversation with one or two friends. Psychologists refer to this as the cocktail party effect. It manifests itself in different ways. For example, we place headphones on a person and present sounds dichotically. The presentation is dichotic when information is delivered to each ear separately. Thus, we might present the left ear with a popular poem, and at the same time present the right ear with a reading from the Bible. Now, the normal observer is able to control which of these two channels of information will be listened to. This itself illustrates the selective nature of attention. An observer can simply choose which stream of information to attend to, hearing either the Bible or the passage from the poem. But now here's an extension of the research. Establishing that the listener is attending to, say, the Bible passage, and we establish this by asking factual questions about the passage after it has been listened to. We then test the listener on what was presented in the unattended channel. Now let's compare the results. The Bible passage is delivered to the left ear, a poetry selection to the right ear, with the listener instructed to attend to the left ear information. If we then test the observer by having him repeat or recall whatever was heard in the left ear, performance will be nearly as good as if nothing had been played into the other ear. In fact, the ability to control our attention is so great that under these conditions, the observer may actually hear nothing delivered to the other ear. In some studies, observers attending carefully to information delivered to one ear were found to be unaware that the other ear received passages in several different languages. Aware, unaware. When we search for words that capture the essence of consciousness, the most common synonym is awareness. To be conscious just is to be aware. And to be aware is to be aware of something. Now, the process by which we are able to direct our awareness is just what we mean by attention. We will sometimes hear on a public address announcement, "Please direct your attention," and we do, or at least we can. It is often, but not always, under our control. Sometimes we are the ones who allow events to enter consciousness, and of course at other times we have no choice in the matter. Now, under normal circumstances, there are two principal means by which events in the external world can be denied access to consciousness. Both involve filtering. One means by which external events are filtered out is fixed, and it's based on the operating characteristics of a particular sensory system. For example, human auditory sensitivity permits us to hear sounds in the frequency range of approximately 20 to 20,000 cycles per second, or hertz. Our sensitivity is greatest in the region of 3,000 to 5,000 cycles per second. Now, as sounds fall far below or rise far above this range, ever greater intensities of sound will be required if we are to hear them. Now, dogs, on the other hand, are responsive to frequencies in the range of 40,000 to 50,000. Mice, upwards of 90,000. The whale, to frequencies in excess of 120,000. Dog whistles are sold, and they are designed to emit sounds that might be irritating to a dog, though entirely inaudible to us. Above a certain frequency, sounds are simply filtered out, not in the manner of the cocktail party effect, but passively. The same is the case in all sensory systems. In human vision, normal color vision finds us seeing colors where the wavelength of light varies between approximately 360 and 760 millimicrons. A millimicron is a millionth of a meter, or a nanometer. Wavelengths below 360 move in the direction of what we call ultraviolet, whereas those above 760 are in the direction of infrared. Now, the honeybee is quite sensitive to ultraviolet radiation, and we are blind to it. Here again, we have an example of a passive filtering system which has nothing to do with attention. Now, the second means by which events in the external world are barred from entry into conscious awareness is that of active filtering. The process is sometimes referred to as selective attention, a good illustration of which is the cocktail party effect. In the absence of such filtering, it would be impossible to adapt to any environment. In noting the difference between plants and animals, Aristotle took the position that the line that ultimately divides the two was established by what? Sensation. To use the phrase now familiar to those who have listened to these lectures, we might have Aristotle put it this way: having sensations is what it is like to be an animal. But the very sensitivity of sensory systems is such that we and other animals would be simply overcome by a flood of sensations were we not able to filter out much that impinges on us. Think of the dog for a moment, whose olfactory sensitivity is so extraordinary. It is estimated that the single epithelial cell in the nose of the dog will respond to the dissipation of one molecule of fatty acid. In a world filled with aromas, a dog could never find his food unless most of that world of smells could get filtered out. The relationship between consciousness and awareness is direct. The relationship between awareness and attention is direct. The processes associated with these are extremely complex and depend on normal functioning and the normal course of development. I noted in an earlier lecture that fish are not likely to discover water, for it is the abiding condition of their lives. I said that consciousness creates a similar problem for us. But if we cannot get outside our own consciousness in order to study it, we might nonetheless learn more about the nature of consciousness by seeing what happens when its functions are defective. In recent decades, there's been a surge in research concerned with the childhood conditions that significantly affect what are finally some of the functions of consciousness. There are profound deficits in the capacity to attend to things, to focus one's mental energies on a particular task, to set realistic goals and carry through step by step to their completion. The conditions have much in common, but medical specialists regard them as distinct. Two of them fall in the category of autism spectrum disorders, or ASD, and include autism proper, and Asperger's syndrome, and there are numerous variants of each of these. Asperger's syndrome, at least at the level of description, is a mild form of the autism disorder syndrome. Those suffering from this condition often have an elevated sensitivity to noise or loud sounds of any sort. They seem to work overtime to filter out such sounds. They display what's sometimes referred to as a kind of auditory defensiveness. Considerable variation is found, of course, but in some instances, the auditory defensiveness expresses itself in the form of filtering out voices. In other cases, it might be something as subtle as the sound of an electric fan that will cause great upset. Autism spectrum disorders are not readily explained in terms of parental failure or insufficiently supportive environments. Specialists are in agreement that the signs of such disorders are often apparent in the first year of life, often very early in the first year. The National Institutes of Health provide a brochure for parents with a checklist as to what to look for. And consider what NIH includes among these signs. The baby doesn't babble, point, or make meaningful gestures by 1 year of age. Does not speak one word by 16 months, or combine 2 words by 2 years. does not respond to his or her name, and after beginning to learn some language, seems to lose it all at once. There are also symptoms that seem closely tied to the failure to direct and maintain conscious awareness. The child is not able to make and keep eye contact with another. The sensory and motor links needed to engage in play seem to be poorly formed and quickly lost. Instead of playing with a toy, the child might simply put them in a line or attend to an insignificant part of the toy, or be compulsively drawn to one toy to the exclusion of all the rest. And through it all, there may be indifference, a seeming deafness to the surrounding social world of other persons. When the NIH document turns to the social dimensions of these disorders, a picture that is at once melancholy and distressing emerges, all the more poignant for its clinical objectivity. Listen to the NIH brochure. Quote, "Children with ASD also are slower in learning to interpret what others are thinking and feeling. Subtle social cues, whether a smile, a wink, or a grimace, may have little meaning. To a child who misses these cues, 'come here' always means the same thing, whether the speaker is smiling and extending her arms for a hug, or frowning and planting her fists on her hips. Without the ability to interpret gestures and facial expressions, the social world may seem bewildering. To compound the problem, people with ASD have difficulty seeing things from another person's perspective. Most 5-year-olds understand that other people have different information, feelings, and goals than they have. A person with ASD may lack such understanding. This inability leaves them unable to predict or understand other people's actions." Close quote. The incidence of these conditions is not negligible. As many as 3 or 4 children per 1,000 will be found to suffer from one or another version. Moreover, the incidence is far higher in boys than in girls, 4 times higher. Heredity has been implicated, for the siblings of a child suffering from one of these disorders are 75 times more likely than average to have the same or similar disorder. In addition to autism and Asperger's syndrome, there is a now veritable epidemic of attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, ADHD, having some similarity to the autism syndromes, but also significant differences. Now, if only because of the seemingly sudden increase in the number of children thus classified, there are now many skeptics inclined to think that what is of epidemic proportions is just the inclination to classify ordinary and quite normal behavioral problems under one or another of these headings. One need not be a skeptic in order to find troubling the large number of young boys and girls on powerful prescription medications, not without worrisome side effects. I should say, speaking personally, that not too many years ago, a college friend of mine visiting his grandson in California made an anxious telephone call to me asking for advice as to whether his grandson should be given Ritalin. Now, although I knew what the answer would be, I asked what the basis was on which the medication was being proposed. Well, quote, "They think he has an attention deficit syndrome," was the answer. With just a few more questions, I was able to establish that the boy had a favorite football team, that he could not be torn away from the television set on Sundays when his team was playing. In other words, he was able to direct and sustain his attention for hours on end. This didn't sound like an attention deficit. However, that he did not direct and sustain his attention in the classroom seemed to be the principal cause of alarm. Well, I should say on that basis, one can only guess as to the number of young boys who might be candidates for medication. Again, I do not rank myself among skeptics in an area such as this. As in most matters of this kind, however, caution is the order of the day. Healthy skepticism is not to be discouraged, but of course anyone who has had exposure to children and even infants suffering from the more severe forms of these conditions quickly surrenders doubt to the weight of evidence. A number of years ago, Public Broadcasting and the BBC collaborated on a 9-part series titled The Mind. Serving as a consultant to that series, I suggested that the first program be titled The Search for Mind. And we included in that program 2 truly tragic cases. One featured a young man suffering from autism. The form it took was not unusual. His emotions were clearly quite flattened relative to what would be normal. He spoke in a monotone. There was no time during the long interview in which he smiled, though at no point would one conclude that he was at all sad or angry. His days were full. He would get on his bicycle and enter on a tour he had prepared for himself, in which towns were to be visited in their alphabetical order. It was essential that this order not be violated, for if he missed a town, if he went out of the order, he would have to begin the journey anew, repeating the sequence in its entirety. When asked to account for the order in which he visited the destinations, well, he said it was governed by the alphabet. In other words, he took it as obvious that the order of letters in the alphabet should govern the order of locations visited. This was not an idea he could be freed from. It had entered into his consciousness as if it were a form of infection. And this was an infection for which there seemed to be no cure. When I say in the form of his autism, we find something not unusual, I don't mean to suggest that large numbers of autistic persons engage in projects of just this kind. But rather what is common across such cases is the obsessional nature of the controlling thoughts. In this regard, autism and obsessional neuroses do have much in common. Persons suffering obsessional disorders engage in repetitive behavior which is organized, at a certain level meaningful, but behavior that finally serves no purpose. The actions in question would be normal if performed once or twice, but they interfere with important aspects of life owing to the obsessional rates of occurrence. Now, common among these activities are the repeated checking of doors, locks, light switches, and electrical appliances, the repetitive washing of clothes, scrubbing of floors, cleaning of hands, an orderliness so strict that there are files of files. In the course of a day, the person may spend hours counting by 6s, repeating their own telephone number, hanging their clothes in the closet, removing them, rehanging them dozens of times. And often for those suffering this form of neurosis combined with obsessional thoughts and compulsive behaviors, obsessed with her guilt, we find Lady Macbeth proceeding to wash her hands repeatedly. The flattening of the emotions so common in autism ties in directly with the diminished capacity for empathy. It's as if one has compartmentalized within one's awareness the sheer physical facts of the environment, now stripped of their larger meaning and of the importance that others might attach to them. Where the Asperger syndrome generates auditory defensiveness, the autistic syndrome seems to generate a kind of emotional defensiveness. The field of consciousness has been narrowed. There's enough room for one or just a few items, and it is on this constricted content that all of the resources of consciousness are focused. Consciousness now thus narrowed, the correctives in reality have no means of access. A century ago, the leading French psychologist Pierre Janet theorized that neurosis at its base just is the narrowing of the field of consciousness. On this account, neurosis is a disorder at the level of information processing, as we might be inclined to put it today. Or, put another way, the filters are too sharply tuned, the bandwidth too narrow for reality to enter into awareness. The second case featured in the Mind series, promoted so many years ago, is even more tragic. The reluctant hero of this was a well-known classical musician, Clive Wearing. Portions of his brain, chiefly the hippocampus, associated with memory, had been destroyed by encephalitis, and the result was a profound form of amnesia. He was unable to retain in memory events taking place even as little as a minute earlier. He was in all respects conscious, alert, aware. Consciousness and awareness, however, our powers, are only as good as the information they have to work on. And Clive Waring's awareness, possessed of no more than bits and pieces of disconnected experience, did not allow him to form so much as a lived day, so much as a lived hour. The search for his own mind, this pathetic search, was moment to moment, with nothing enduring. Now, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, we learn something about conscious life by examining the consequences of having something go wrong with it. In the normal course of events, the phenomenon of the cocktail party effect is taken for granted. We benefit from the fact that we are able to focus our attention on what matters to us. In fact, we often become even peevish when the world intrudes upon what does matter for us and calls upon us to redirect our attention away from something that we were interested in. But think of the hazards we would face were we unable to have our awareness thus redirected at all, ever. Imagine if we couldn't be distracted by the approach of the saber-toothed tiger, or the shouts of those who've noticed the outbreak of a fire, or cries for help coming from the lakeshore. These exemplify the hazards actually faced by those who suffer from the conditions I've summarized in this lecture. Conscious life and awareness are not restricted to information processing. In that neutral sense of information, we have to admit there's much more than that involved. We hear in the voice of another and see on the face of another evidence of grief or joy or hopefulness. We are able to integrate this information with that provided by the balance of the context. Owing to certain normal and natural dispositions, the result of this integration is in the form of empathy and sympathy. Again, following Thomas Nagel's useful phrase, we come to know what it's like to be someone else, in a manner of speaking. And this is an achievement of conscious awareness and the integrative achievements of the mind. It's the achievement that grounds social and interpersonal life. It makes possible an understanding of lives different from our own. Again, try to imagine the quality of life available to those unable to perform these integrations and reach these states of awareness. Now, there is a caution warranted here, however. It's never a simple task to uncover what it's like to be someone else. We may have their words, and we may watch them behave, but this is about as close as we're likely to get to their interior lives. If the behavior is impoverished, if the words seem to be lacking in affective elements, if the voice is flat and the face somewhat fixed, we may greatly and gravely underestimate what is taking place within that field of consciousness to which our own access is inevitably incomplete. Few have done as much to alert us to this as Oliver Sacks, especially in that celebrated book of his of 1985, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. The book is based on clinical investigations by Dr. Sacks of patients suffering from right hemisphere defects. One of those patients, Jose, displayed the full range of autistic symptoms. Accordingly, he was largely neglected by the medical staff and ignored even by members of his own family. But having given Jose a pad and pencil, Sacks was amazed at the accuracy of the drawings so quickly produced. What one found in the drawings, one would not have found in Jose's conduct, let alone his speech, which was utterly inarticulate. Jose produced sketches clearly revealing a comprehension of the feelings of others, things of importance, objects with a very deep meaning. I recall as a graduate student in neuropsychology hearing a visiting lecturer say that everyone in the audience was epileptic. As the speaker was famous, and as we knew sooner or later some sort of examination would determine whether we were listening carefully, I recorded these remarks in my notebook, but listened even more carefully to the main point the speaker was attempting to convey. Nerve and muscle are excitable tissues. Their intended function is to be active. The brain is an extraordinary ensemble of excitable cells. In the normal case, the level of excitation is just what is required for us to accomplish the sorts of things on which survival and progress depend. Nonetheless, every brain has a threshold for seizures. Now, those of us who would resist being called epileptic and who have never had a seizure simply have never faced the conditions capable of generating seizure activity in our brains. But such conditions there are. While recalling the shock value of the speaker's surprising diagnosis of his audience, I'm tempted to heighten the awareness of my own listeners today by claiming that, well, we are all autistic, compulsive, obsessional, etc., etc. Unless we're in treatment or significantly limited in our attempts to get through the challenges of the day, we surely can take comfort in the fact that the world has not yet found stimulating or oppressive conditions sufficient to reveal full-blown autism, compulsivity, and obsessional neuroses. But who has never returned from a meeting or a party or a social gathering without recalling some offensive remark or minor insult that might actually grate on one for hours or even days? In the language of today's therapists, we would be told not to, quote, obsess. But we do. And we often ignore otherwise clear signs of distress in others. We fail to display the joy and appreciation that the kindness of others warrants. We often continue to engage in practices that have a long history of producing no more than failure and frustration. Now, I'm not sure all of this adds up to knowing what it is like to be autistic or neurotic, and I'm surely not a Freudian psychoanalyst, but I'm rather more confident that it does add up to this: not knowing what it is like to be our better self. I've only been able to sample a few of the clinical conditions that display certain aspects of conscious life and awareness otherwise obscured by normal life. There are many other conditions, some of them quite harrowing, which would make the same point even more starkly. There is a wide range of psychiatric illnesses classified as dissociative disorders, which might involve large gaps in memory or the adoption of new and multiple personalities seemingly having nothing to do with the real life of the patient. Another version, referred to as depersonalization disorder, finds the patient seeing himself at a distance and reflecting on his own behavior as if he were a different and disinterested witness. Within the framework of consciousness and awareness, these conditions are especially intriguing, for the patients have consciousness and are aware, often acutely aware. We've come up with labels for these various conditions. We seem to be better at creating labels than treatments. Many of the treatments, even the successful ones, seem to work for reasons that cannot yet be fathomed. Then, too, there are the many altered states of consciousness. Some of these come about through meditation. Some come about through the use and the misuse of drugs and herbs and alcohol. There's a vast and popular literature on all this, readily available, nearly unavoidable. I'll say nothing about it. I note only that, given the importance, the very centrality of healthy, self-controlled, conscious resources, well, it's always wise to leave well enough alone.